In a world full of religions, leaders, and promises, there was a man who didn't just talk about God, but acted as if he were God. A man who touched the sick, and they were healed. Who spoke to the wind, and the wind obeyed. Who looked at sinners, and their lives changed forever. But the most impactful thing was not his miracles, but what he said about himself. If you like biblical stories like this, subscribe because I upload new stories every week. Because this is not just an ancient story. It is the story that changed the destiny of humanity, and that even today continues to divide the world. Who was this man really? Why did multitudes follow him, but others wanted to kill him? And what led him, step by step, toward Jerusalem, knowing exactly what awaited him? Throughout this story, you will discover his most impactful miracles, his deepest teachings, and the hidden reason behind each of his steps. But there is something you must understand from now on. Nothing he did was by accident. Every word, every miracle, every decision, was bringing him closer to an inevitable moment. A moment that would change everything. And just when you think you understand who Jesus was, you will realize that you are just beginning to really see him. Because his story does not begin with his death. It begins much earlier, in silence, in the invisible, in a plan that was already in motion from the beginning. And what you are about to discover changes everything. Long before anyone heard his name, before the miracles, before the crowds, a whisper was already running through history. It was not a weak whisper, it was a promise. One that had been repeated generation after generation, in times of war, in times of silence, in moments where everything seemed lost. The ancient prophets had spoken of someone who would come. Not as a simple teacher, not as just another leader, but as someone completely different. A king, but without a crown. A liberator, but without an army. A light, in the midst of the deepest darkness. And for centuries, the world waited. But over time, many stopped believing. The promises became distant stories. The words became tradition. And hope began to slowly fade away. Because the reality was different. The people lived under oppression. Fear was part of daily life. Injustice seemed normal. And God seemed silent. But what no one knew is that silence was not absence. It was preparation. Because in the least expected moment, when the world seemed furthest from God, everything began. Not on a throne. Not in a temple full of power. Not in the center of attention. But in the hidden. In the life of a young woman, without wealth, without influence, without power. A common life, until that instant. A message arrived. It was not a human message. It was not something that could be explained with logic. It was a direct declaration that something impossible was about to happen. That a child would be born, but would not be like the others. That his origin would not follow the rules of the world. That his purpose would not be understood by everyone. And that his life would change history forever. And so, everything began. Without noise. Without a spectacle. Without the world really understanding what was happening. Jesus was born. And although many saw him as just another child, there were signs. Silent, but profound signs. Because even from the beginning, there was something distinct about him. He did not seek attention. He did not need to prove anything. But his presence was different. There was a strange peace, an authority that was not imposed, but was felt. As he grew, he did not do it like any other. It was not just his intelligence, it was not just his way of speaking, it was the way in which he understood things. As if he saw beyond the visible. As if he heard beyond words. As if he knew what others were just beginning to question. And although his life was quiet, although there were no crowds following him yet, although the world followed its normal course, something was advancing. Slowly. In silence. But with precision. Because this was not improvised. Every moment of his life, every stage, every year, formed part of a plan. A plan that not everyone would understand. A plan that even his own followers would take time to comprehend. A plan that was not just about teaching, nor just about performing miracles, but about something much deeper. Because Jesus did not simply come to talk about God. He came to reveal something that would change the way the world understood everything. Life. Sin. Forgiveness. Purpose. And, above all, the relationship between God and humanity. But before that was evident, before the crowds followed him, before the sick were healed, before the religious leaders began to fear him, there was a key moment. An exact point in time, where everything would cease to be invisible. A moment where the silence would end. Where the hidden would become evident. Where the spiritual would touch the visible in a way impossible to ignore. Because until that moment, Jesus had lived in the ordinary. But what was about to happen would mark the beginning of the extraordinary. A moment where heaven would not remain in silence. A moment where a voice would break normality. A moment that would not only reveal who Jesus was, but would change the perception of all who were present. And after that moment, there would no longer be a way to see him as someone common. There would no longer be a way to ignore him. There would no longer be a way to stop what was about to begin. Because the time of waiting had ended. And what was coming would not only surprise the world, it would confront it. For years, everything had remained in silence. Jesus had grown, had observed, had waited. But the moment arrived. Not with an announcement in palaces, nor with trumpets, but in an unexpected place. The desert. There, far from the cities, far from power, far from noise, a man was preparing the way. John. A man different from everyone. He did not dress like the others. He did not speak like the others. He did not seek to please. His message was clear, direct, uncomfortable. Prepare yourselves. Repent. Because something is about to happen. And the people began to listen. Crowds came out from the cities, left everything behind, and walked toward the desert. Because something in his words did not sound like religion. It sounded like truth. One after another, they entered the water, confessed their mistakes, and came out different. But John knew something. He knew that he was not the center of the story. After me, someone greater is coming. I am not worthy even to untie his sandals. And then, it happened. One day, among the crowd, someone arrived. Not with visible signs. Not with an impressive entrance. Simply, walking. Jesus. And although no one else seemed to notice it at first, John did. Something changed. The atmosphere became distinct. The moment became heavy, important, inevitable. Jesus entered the water. Not because he needed to repent. Not because he had sin. But because he was beginning something. Something that no one would finish understanding at that moment. The water moved slowly, the crowd observed, silence began to be felt. And then, everything changed. When Jesus came out of the water, heaven did not remain in silence. It opened. Not as a metaphor. Not as an idea. It opened. And something descended. Like a dove, but with a spiritual weight that no one could ignore. The Spirit. And in that instant, a voice. Not from the earth. Not from any man. A voice that came from heaven itself. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Time seemed to stop. It was not just a spiritual moment. It was a declaration, a direct revelation. Jesus was not just a teacher. He was not just a prophet. He was something more, much more. And from that instant, everything changed. Because what had been hidden now began to be revealed. But the most surprising thing was not what occurred in heaven. It was what occurred after. Because instead of going toward the crowds, instead of taking advantage of the moment, instead of beginning with visible signs, Jesus did the unexpected. He left. Not toward the city, but toward the desert. Alone. Guided, not by people, but by the Spirit. And there, in solitude, in silence, in the place where there are no distractions, the true test began. Because before changing the world, before facing crowds, before confronting systems, he had to face something else. Temptation. It was not just a difficult moment. It was a direct confrontation. An invisible battle, but more real than any other. For days, without food, without company, without rest, Jesus was tested. Not with physical force, but with something deeper. Identity. Purpose. Power. It was an invitation to take an easier path. To avoid suffering. To use his power for himself. To be a king, but without sacrifice. To have authority, but without surrender. And in that moment, everything was at stake. Because if he failed, everything ended there. But he did not fail. Where others had fallen, he remained firm. Where others chose the easy path, he chose the right one. And when the temptation ended, something became clear. Jesus was not just someone with power. He was someone with dominion, with clarity, with purpose. And now, yes, the silence had ended. The preparation had ended. The wait had ended. Because after the desert, Jesus returned. But not as before. Now there was something distinct. His words had weight. His actions had impact. His presence attracted the crowds. And what began to happen after, no one could stop it. Because the man who came out of the desert did not just bring a message. He brought authority. And the world was about to discover it. When Jesus came out of the desert, he did not return as someone unknown. Something had changed. Not in his appearance, not in his way of dressing, but in the way in which everything around him reacted. Because now, when he spoke, people listened. And they did not just listen, they stopped. There was something in his words that they could not ignore. They were not long speeches, they were not complicated explanations, they were simple phrases, but with a weight impossible to explain. The kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe. And those words did not sound like religion. They sounded like a warning, like an invitation, like a truth that made one uncomfortable, but attracted. Because while others taught rules, Jesus spoke of transformation. While others spoke of tradition, he spoke of something that was occurring now. And that changed everything. But it was not just his words. It was his actions. One day, entering a synagogue, the place where the teachers taught the law, Jesus began to speak. And in a matter of minutes, the atmosphere changed. People looked at one another. Something was not normal. Because he did not speak like the other teachers. He did not quote others. He did not debate ideas. He did not seek approval. He spoke as if he were the authority itself. As if he were not interpreting the truth, but declaring it. And just in that moment, something unexpected occurred. A man, who was in the place, began to react in a strange way. His voice changed. His behavior became uncontrollable. And then he shouted, "What do you have with us? Have you come to destroy us?" The silence was immediate. No one understood completely what was happening, but everyone knew something. This was not normal. And then Jesus responded. Not with fear. Not with doubt. Not with long rituals. Only with an order. Be quiet, and come out of him. And in that instant, the presence that tormented that man disappeared. The man was left free. Just like that, immediately. Without apparent effort. Without visible struggle. Only authority. The people were left in shock. Because he had not only taught with authority, they had just seen that authority in action. "What is this?" they said. "Even the spirits obey him." And from that moment, his name began to spread. From town to town. From house to house. From mouth to mouth. But not everyone reacted the same. Because while some felt hope, others began to feel threatened. Especially the religious leaders. Those who had dedicated their lives to teaching, to interpreting the law, to maintaining the spiritual order, now they saw someone who did not follow their rules. Someone who did not ask for permission. Someone who did not submit to their system. And that was dangerous. Because Jesus did not only teach differently, he lived differently. He did not avoid sinners. He did not move away from the rejected. He did not maintain distance from those considered impure. On the contrary, he drew near. He spoke with them. He looked at them without contempt. He treated them with dignity. And that broke all expectations. Because in that time, religion separated. But Jesus united. And that confused many. How could someone who spoke of God relate with people considered unworthy? How could someone with so much authority show such humility? It did not fit. It did not follow the pattern. And the more they observed him, the more evident it became, Jesus did not come to adapt to the system. He came to confront it. Each time he spoke, he exposed the superficial. Each time he acted, he showed a deeper reality. It was not about external rules, but about something internal. From the heart. And that was much more difficult to accept. Because it is easier to change what you do than what you are. And Jesus aimed directly at that. That is why his words did not only inspire, they also made one uncomfortable. Because they did not permit neutrality. Either you accepted him, or you rejected him. There was no middle ground. And while the tension grew, something else grew too. Expectation. Because people began to ask themselves, who is this man really? A prophet? A teacher? One sent by God? Or something more? But that answer would not arrive immediately. Because Jesus did not reveal everything at once. He did it step by step. Miracle after miracle. Teaching after teaching. Encounter after encounter. And each time someone thought they already understood him, he did something that completely broke that idea. Because Jesus did not come to fulfill human expectations. He came to reveal a truth that no one was completely prepared to accept. And what would come next would make that question impossible to ignore. Because if his words already had an impact, what he was about to do would leave all without an explanation. And in that moment, it would no longer be just a question of listening. It would be a question of believing. The multitudes continued growing. At first, they came out of curiosity. Then, out of necessity. But now, they came for something more difficult to explain. There was something in Jesus that was not just seen, it was felt. Because he did not only perform miracles, he spoke. And when he spoke, no one remained the same. He did not teach like the others. He did not repeat what others had already said. He did not depend on traditions. He did not seek approval. He spoke with a clarity that pierced through everything. One day, in front of a multitude, he began to teach in a way that no one expected. He did not use complex speeches. He did not use difficult language. He told stories. Simple stories, but with deep meanings. Stories that anyone could understand, but that not everyone could accept. He spoke of sowers, of seeds, of paths, of hearts. And while some only listened to his story, others began to realize something. Jesus was not speaking about agriculture. He was speaking about them. About how they listened. About how they lived. About how they responded to the truth. And suddenly, everything became personal. Because it was no longer just listening, it was confronting oneself. On another occasion, he spoke of a man who had 2 sons. One who left, who wasted everything, who fell to the lowest point. And another who stayed, who did the right thing, but who had the wrong heart. And at the end of the story, no one knew exactly who was right. Because Jesus was not telling a story to entertain, he was revealing something uncomfortable. That it was not only about what you do, but about what there is inside of you. And that was not easy to accept. Because the majority of people preferred to think that they were okay. That they complied. That they did the right thing. That they were on the right side. But Jesus broke that idea. He said things like, "The last will be first. He who exalts himself will be humbled. He who wants to be great must serve." And those words did not fit. They went against everything that the world taught. Because the world said, seek power, seek recognition, protect what is yours. But Jesus said the contrary. Give. Serve. Forgive. Love, even he who does not deserve it. And there, many began to doubt. Because listening to that is one thing. Living it is another completely different thing. But Jesus did not soften his message. He did not make it easier. He did not adapt it to please. Because his objective was not to be accepted. It was to transform. And transformation is always uncomfortable. In another teaching, looking at the people, he said something that no one expected. You have heard that you must love your friends, but I tell you, love your enemies. The silence was immediate. That made no sense. Loving the enemy was not logical, was not just, was not human. But Jesus was not speaking of logic. He was revealing something higher. A way of living that did not depend on what others do, but on who you decide to be. And that completely changed the rules. Because it was no longer about reacting, but about deciding. It was not about human justice, but about something deeper. And while some felt attracted by those words, others began to resist. Because his teachings were not only difficult, they were radical. They did not permit half decisions. They did not permit continuing the same. Either you changed, or you moved away. And that created a division. Not visible at first, but increasingly more real. Because the more he taught, the clearer it was, Jesus did not come to confirm what the people already believed. He came to challenge it. To redefine everything. Faith. Justice. Forgiveness. Truth. Even the relationship with God. Because he no longer spoke of God as something distant. He spoke as someone close. Accessible. Real. Present. And that was revolutionary. Because if what he said was certain, then everything must change. Not only the external, but the internal. Not only the actions, but the intentions. Not only religion, but the heart. And while his words continued spreading, something else began to happen. Because it was no longer only his teachings that had an impact, it was his actions. Because what he said, he demonstrated. And what was about to occur would make even the most skeptical have to confront a reality impossible to ignore. Because if his words were already difficult to accept, his miracles would be impossible to explain. At first, they were only words. Words that made one uncomfortable. Words that inspired. Words that made one think. But it reached a point in which it was no longer only about listening. Because what Jesus did began to challenge all logic. Rumors began to run rapidly. He is not only a teacher. Something else is happening. I have seen things that I cannot explain. And then, the miracles began. Not as a spectacle. Not as a demonstration of power to impress. But as a response. Response to pain. Response to suffering. Response to human desperation. One day, a house was completely full. There was no space. Not even at the entrance. The people were pressed together, trying to listen, trying to draw near. And suddenly, something fell from the roof. Dust, wood, movement. All raised their gaze. A group of men had opened the roof. And slowly, they lowered a paralytic. They could not enter through the door, so they found another way. Because they were convinced of something, if they managed to put him in front of Jesus, everything could change. The man was motionless. Without control over his body. Dependent, limited, trapped. And all expected the same thing. That Jesus would heal him. But what he said first surprised all. "Son, your sins are forgiven." The silence was immediate. That was not the expected thing. That was not what they had asked for. And in that moment, the religious leaders thought the same. Who can forgive sins, except God? But Jesus knew what they thought. And then, he did something that would change everything. Which is easier? To say your sins are forgiven, or to say get up and walk? No one responded. Because all knew that both things were impossible. But then, Jesus looked at the man and said, "Get up." And in that instant, what did not move, moved. What was paralyzed, responded. The man got up. Not slowly. Not with difficulty. He got up completely healthy. He took his stretcher and went out walking. In front of all. The impact was immediate. The people were not only surprised, they were in shock. Because they had not seen only a healing. They had seen authority over the invisible and over the visible. And that was impossible to ignore. But he was not the only one. The miracles began to multiply. A leper, rejected by all, untouchable, isolated, drew near. Without fear. Without apparent dignity. Only with a phrase, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus did not retreat. He did not avoid him. He touched him. And in that instant, the disease disappeared. Not progressively. Not with time. Immediately. The skin restored. The life restored. The dignity restored. And again, the people could not understand it. But it did not end there. One day, the wind began to rise. The sea agitated violently. The waves struck the boat. The disciples, experienced fishermen, knew what that meant. Real danger. Possible death. And in the midst of the chaos, Jesus slept. as if nothing was happening. Desperate, they woke him. "We are going to sink." And then Jesus got up. He did not run. He did not enter into panic. He only spoke. "Silence, be calm." And the wind obeyed. The sea calmed down. Instantly. Not little by little. Immediately. The chaos became calm. And now the fear changed. Because they no longer had fear of the storm, they had fear of him. Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? But there was still more. Because if he had authority over diseases and over nature, he also had it over the spiritual. A man lived among tombs, isolated, out of control, dominated by something that no one could stop. No one could help him. No one could contain him. But when Jesus arrived, everything changed. There was no visible struggle. There was no ritual. Only a direct confrontation. And what dominated that man had to go. The man was left free, in calm, in peace, restored, as if he had never been thus. And in that moment, there was no longer doubt. This was not normal. This was not common. This could not be explained. Because Jesus did not only speak differently, he did not only teach differently, he did not only live differently, he had authority over all. Over the body, over nature, over the spiritual. And that left a single question. One that already could not be ignored. Who is he really? Because a teacher does not do this. A prophet does not do this. This was something more. Something that the world could not classify easily. And while some began to believe, others began to worry. Because if this was real, then everything had to change. The system, the beliefs, the power, all. And that was dangerous. But Jesus did not stop. He did not lower the rhythm. He did not avoid the impact. On the contrary, each miracle, each act, each moment made the question bigger, more urgent, more impossible to ignore. And just when it seemed that the answer was close, Jesus did something unexpected. He did not only heal, he did not only liberate, he began to choose people, common men, imperfect, without special preparation, for something that would change their lives and the world. Because what came after would not be about only what he would do, but of whom he would take with him. As the miracles increased and the multitudes grew, also grew a necessity. Because this no longer was about only what Jesus did, but of what would come after. The people followed him, listened to him. They were surprised. But very few understood really. Because to see is not the same as to comprehend. And to listen is not the same as to follow. For that reason, in the middle of all the movement, Jesus began to do something different. He did not seek the most prepared. He did not choose the most wise. He did not call the most influential. He chose common people, fishermen, men with errors, men with doubts, men without prestige, and that did not have sense. Because if someone wanted to change the world, they would not begin thus. But Jesus was not building a human system. He was forming something completely distinct. One day, walking together with the sea, he saw two men, Simon and Andrew. They were working in their routine, in what they knew, nothing extraordinary. And then Jesus looked at them and said, "Follow me." Nothing more. Without explanation. Without details. without visible promises. Only 2 words. But those 2 words changed all. Because it was not a common invitation. It was a call. And there was something in that call that could not be ignored. It was not pressure. It was not obligation. It was something deeper. Something that crossed doubts, fears, and logic. And in that moment, they left all. The nets. The work. The security. And they followed him. Not because they understood all, but because they knew that something was different. And they were not the only ones. Further ahead, other 2 men, James and John, also working, also in the daily. And again, the same call. And again, the same response. They left all, even their father, because following Jesus was not adding something to their life. It was changing it all. And that is what many did not understand. Because the majority thought that they could listen to Jesus, learn from him, and continue living the same way. But Jesus never offered that. Never said, only listen to me when you have time. Never said, only take what suits you. He said, follow me. And to follow him had a cost. A real cost. To leave the known. To let go of control. To walk toward the unknown. Without knowing exactly to where all was going. But with the certainty that it was worth the pain. Because being close to Jesus was different. They did not only see miracles, they lived them. They did not only listen to teachings, they faced them. Because to follow him was not comfortable. It was confronting. Jesus did not hide that. He did not soften the path. He spoke to them of sacrifice, of surrender, of losing to gain. And that was not easy. Because even they doubted. Sometimes they did not understand. Sometimes they feared. Sometimes they wanted to retreat. But something maintained them. Something stronger than the doubt. They had seen too much. They had listened to too much. They had felt that they could not return to that of before. Because when someone really finds something true, already they cannot ignore it. And that was happening with them. But not all was clear. Because although they walked with him, although they saw his miracles, although they listened to his words, yet they did not comprehend completely who he was. They had ideas. They had expectations. They thought of a leader, in a king, in someone that would change the system. But what Jesus was doing went much beyond. Because he did not only gather followers. He was forming witnesses. Persons that would not only see, but would carry the message. But before that, before they understood their purpose, before all had sense, they had to pass through something more. Because to follow Jesus did not only signify learning, it signified confronting all that they believed they knew. And that barely was beginning. Because while they walked with him, and the world began to observe, the question continued growing. Stronger. Clearer. More urgent. Who is really Jesus? Because already it was not sufficient to say that he was a teacher. Already it was not sufficient to say that he was a prophet. What they were seeing, what they were living, pointed to something much bigger. And soon, that question would leave being optional. Because the response would change all. At these heights, already there was no doubt of something. Jesus was not like the others. He did not speak like the teachers. He did not act like the leaders. He did not behave like someone that sought power. And that was impossible to ignore. But the question continued growing, what made him different? Because many taught. Some made miracles. Others had followers. But Jesus was another thing. Not only for what he did, but for how he did it. Because where others imposed, he invited. Where others judged, he restored. Where others elevated themselves, he drew near. And that broke completely the mold. The religious leaders of the epoch had a clear structure. Rules, norms, separation. There were accepted persons and rejected persons. There was purity and there was impurity. And all was defined. But Jesus crossed those lines, spoke with whom he should not, touched whom no one touched, sat with whom were avoided. And he did not do it for rebellion. He did it with purpose. Because he did not see the persons like the system saw them. Saw beyond. Saw the heart. And that changed all. Because while others measured behavior, he looked at intention. While others saw errors, he saw opportunity. While others closed doors, he opened them. And that generated a growing tension. Because if what he did was correct, then all the system was wrong. And that was dangerous. But the most impactful thing was not only his compassion, it was his authority. Because Jesus did not only say, God says, said, I say. And that was completely different. Because no teacher spoke thus. No one placed himself in that place. No one assumed that level of authority. But he did it with naturalness, without arrogance, without doubt, as if it were the most normal. And that left all in an uncomfortable position. Because there were two options. Or he was wrong, or he was who he said he was. And both options were difficult to accept. But there was something more. Something that made that all was yet more profound. Jesus did not only teach with authority, he lived with coherence. Did not ask for something that he himself did not do. Did not demand without giving. Did not speak of love without demonstrating it. Because when he saw someone to suffer, did not retreat. Drew near. When he saw someone to fall, did not condemn him. Lifted him. When he saw someone lost, did not reject him. Sought him. And that was completely distinct. Because the power normally is used for to dominate. But in him, it was used for to serve. And that confused all. How could someone with so much power not use it for to impose himself? How could someone with so much authority not seek recognition? How could someone that could be served choose to serve? It did not fit. It did not follow any human logic. And while the more they observed him, the more evident it was, Jesus did not only teach a truth. He was the truth. But that idea was too big for many. Because to accept it signified to change it all. Not only what they believed, but how they lived. Not only their actions, but their identity. And that was not easy. For that reason some drew near, and others retreated. Some believed, and others doubted. Some followed him, and others began to plan to stop him. Because his presence did not leave anyone equal. Did not permit indifference. Did not permit neutrality. And while that division grew, also grew another thing. The tension. Because Jesus was not retreating. Was not softening his message. Was not avoiding the conflict. On the contrary. Each time he spoke with more clarity. Each time he acted with more firmness. Each time he revealed more. And that began to bother the persons with power. Because already it was not about only of teachings. It was about of influence. Of impact. Of transformation. The multitudes followed him. The people listened to him. the lives changed. And that was a threat. Because when the truth enters, the control weakens. And those that were accustomed to control began to worry. Because they knew something. If this continued, all would change. And they would lose their place. But while they planned, Jesus advanced. With calm, with determination, with purpose. Because he knew something that no one else understood completely. Knew toward where he went. Knew what came. Knew that all this was not the final. It was only the path. A path that was leading him directly to Jerusalem. And that path would not be easy. Because the more clear it became who he was, the more dangerous it became to follow him. And what was about to happen would not only reveal his identity, but the true purpose of all. A purpose that many would not accept. A purpose that would change the history. And a purpose that was more close of what anyone imagined. Something began to change. Not in the miracles. Not in the teachings. But in the environment. What before was amazement, now began to mix with tension. The multitudes followed there. The sick followed seeking healing. The disciples followed walking with him. But behind all that, something more was moving. Silent. Hidden. But real. The religious leaders already not only observed. Now, they analyzed. Each word. Each action. Each movement. Because what before seemed something passenger, now had become impossible to ignore. Jesus was not diminishing. Was growing. His influence increased. His impact expanded. His name became known in all parts. And that was dangerous. Because the power established does not tolerate easily what it cannot control. But the most inquietant was not only what the others saw. It was what Jesus knew. Because while all reacted, he already understood. Knew toward where all went. Knew what was by to come. And even so, did not stop. On the contrary, began to speak with more clarity. Already not only in parables. Already not only in insinuations. Now said things that his own disciples could not comprehend completely. Spoke of rejection. Spoke of suffering. Spoke of death. And each time that he did it, they confused. Because it did not fit. How could someone with that power could speak of to lose? How could someone that controlled the nature could speak of to be delivered? Did not have sense. They expected victory. They expected conquest. They expected a visible kingdom, immediate, powerful. But Jesus spoke of something distinct. Something that they could not see completely. And that inquieted them. But they were not the only ones. Because while the disciples struggled to understand, the religious leaders already had taken a decision. This had to stop. They could not permit that it continued. They could not permit that someone questioned their authority. They could not permit that the people began to think different. Because if that passed, all what they had built would collapse. And thus began the plans. Not public. Not evident. But real. Plans for to discredit him. For to trap him in his words. For to find a reason, any reason, for to eliminate him. And while those plans developed in secret, Jesus advanced. Step by step. Without haste, but without to stop. As someone that is not reacting, but fulfilling something. And that something had a destination. Jerusalem. The city more important. The center religious. The place where all converged. And also, the place where all would change. Because to enter Jerusalem was not a movement any. It was a declaration. It was to expose himself completely. It was to walk direct toward the place where were those that wanted to stop him. And even so, Jesus went. Not obligated. Not pushed. Decided. Because this was not an accident. It was not an error. It was part of the purpose. And while he drew near, the tension increased. The persons began to speak. Is near. Goes toward Jerusalem. This go to change all. And some felt emotion. Others, fear. Because they knew what it signified. Nothing would continue equal. When finally he drew near to the city, something impactful occurred. The multitudes went out to receive him. Not with fear. With enthusiasm. With hope. With expectation. They shouted. They celebrated. They recognized him. Hosanna. They treated him like to a king. As if finally had arrived the moment. As if all was by to fulfill. And by an instant, seemed that all went in that direction. Victory. Recognition. Acceptance. But beneath of that celebration, there was a reality that few understood. Because while the people celebrated, the leaders observed. And what they saw confirmed their fears. This had to finish. They could not let that it continued. And from that moment, the decision was firm. It was not a question of if, but of when. Meanwhile, Jesus entered in the city. Not with arrogance. Not with force military. But with a calm that contrasted with all. Observed. Each place. Each person. Each detail. As someone that knows that is in the point exact, where all converges. And in middle of all that, sus discípulos yet did not understand completely. Saw the celebration, but did not see the danger. Listened the shouts, but did not perceive the threat. But Jesus, yes, knew that the same multitude that today celebrated could change. Knew that the enthusiasm could turn into rejection. Knew that what seemed victory was not the final, was the initio of something much more profound. And while the days advanced, the tension turned more evident. The confrontations increased. The questions turned traps. The looks more intense. All was aligning, like pieces of something inevitable. And in middle of all that, there was a last piece. One that no one suspected completely. One that would change the course immediate of all. Because no would come from out, would come from close. Very close. From someone that had been with him. That had listened his words. That had seen his miracles. That had walked at his side. And even so, was about to take a decision. A decision that would open the door to all what was about to come. Because the path to Jerusalem did not finish in the city. Finished in a betrayal. And that moment already was close. Too close. The city was full. Jerusalem was not the same of always. There was movement. There was noise. There was expectation. But also, there was something more. A tension that not saw itself, but felt itself. The days advanced, and each moment seemed more heavy than the anterior. The conversations already not were innocents. The looks already not were neutrals. All was charged. And in middle of all that, Jesus knew. Not needed that no one to him had said. Not needed signals externals. Knew. Knew that the time had arrived. Knew that each step him had led exactly to this point. And even thus, not retreated. Not changed the rumbo. Not avoided the moment. It faced. With calm. With clarity. With a determination that no one else could understand completely. That night, all seemed normal. A table. A group close. A moment shared. His disciples were there. The same that had walked with him. Those that had seen all. Those that had left all. But something was different. The environment was not light. There was silence in moments where before there was conversation. There were looks that sought to understand, without to achieve it. Because although they were close, not saw completely. And then, Jesus spoke. Not with parables. Not with indirects. With clarity. One of you, it go to betray. The silence was immediate. The looks changed. The hearts accelerated. Who? That was the only question. Because no one wanted to believe it. Not after of all the lived. Not after of all the seen. And one to one, began to ask themselves, am I? Because in the fondo, knew something. That not treated itself only of actions, but of the heart. And in middle of that uncertainty, there was one, that already had taken a decision. Not impulsive. Not sudden. A decision that had formed itself in silence. That had grown, little by little. Between doubts. Between expectations broken. Between an idea of Jesus, that not coincided with the reality. Judas had seen the miracles. Had listened the teachings. Had walked together to him. But something inside of him, already not was aligned. And that night, that conflict internal, arrived to his point final. Because while all wondered, he already knew. And Jesus also. But the most impactful, is that not him stopped. Not him exposed in front of all. Not him rejected in that moment. Simply, him permitted. Because this, also formed part of the purpose. A purpose that no one understood completely. A path that not could itself to avoid. A moment, that already not could delay itself. And while the night advanced, while the shadows turned themselves more profound, while the city continued without understanding what was about to occur, Judas rose and went out, without noise, without announcement, without that all understood what just had to happen. But something had changed, of manner definitive, because with that step, the betrayal already not was in possibility, was in reality. And what came after, already not could stop itself. Because the moment, finally had arrived. And this time, no would have vuelta back.